The 2nd of August, 1939, a summer dawn over the North Sea. The largest airship ever built drifts slowly down the eastern coast of England, its silver hull catching the early light. This is the Graf Zeppelin II, and it is not carrying passengers. Packed inside its hull are radio receivers, antennas, and a team of German signals specialists hunched over their dials. They are listening. The mission was ordered by a Luftwaffe general named Wolfgang Martini, the man in charge of German Air Force communications. Martini has a suspicion. He has noticed the strange new towers rising along the English coast, tall steel lattice masts arranged in lines, and he wants to know what they are, so he has sent his most sensitive listening equipment up into the sky to find out. The men on the airship sweep across the wavebands they expect a defensive system to use. They hear engine ignition noise. They hear ordinary radio traffic. They hear nothing that looks like a coastal detection network. And so they fly home and report that the towers are probably for long-range radio communication, nothing to worry about. They had drifted for hours directly alongside one of the most important military inventions of the 20th century, and they had missed it completely. Here is the part that should make you stop. While the Germans were listening and hearing nothing, the towers were watching them. British operators picked up that airship and tracked it along the coast. The hunters had become the hunted, and they never knew it. This is the story of how Britain built something the Germans could not see even when they flew straight through it. It is not the story you have been told. The popular version says Britain invented radar, and that radar won the Battle of Britain. Both of those claims are wrong. Germany had radar too. In several ways, German radar was better than anything Britain possessed. The truth is stranger and more interesting than the legend. Britain did not win because it had a better machine. Britain won because it built something the Germans never thought to build at all. And to understand what that was, we have to go back to a memo about a death ray. In the early 1930s, the British Air Ministry was frightened. The bomber, many believed, would always get through. There seemed to be no defense against fleets of aircraft arriving over London. In desperation, officials asked whether science could build a radio death ray, a beam powerful enough to kill a pilot or stop an engine. In January of 1935, that question reached a Scottish scientist named Robert Watson Watt. He asked his assistant, Arnold Wilkins, to run the numbers. Wilkins quickly showed that a death ray was impossible, but he added a thought that changed everything. A passing aircraft, he pointed out, would scatter radio waves, and those faint echoes could be detected. You could not kill the aircraft with radio, but you could see it coming. On the 26th of February 1935, they tested the idea near the town of Daventry. They used the powerful signal from a BBC radio transmitter and set up a simple receiver in a field. A Royal Air Force bomber flew back and forth through the beam. On a small screen, a green line twitched and danced each time the aircraft passed. Only 3 men watched it happen. The principle was proven in a quiet English field with borrowed equipment. Within weeks, the work moved to the coast, and then to a country house called Bawdsey Manor in Suffolk, which became the first true radar station in the world. The system they built was called chain home, and by the standards of physics it was crude. It used very long radio waves, around 10 to 13 meters, broadcast from fixed steel towers that stood about 360 feet tall. It could not be aimed like a searchlight. It flooded the sky in front of it and read the echoes that bounced back. It was imprecise, and it could not see aircraft flying low over the water. The scientists knew it was imperfect. Watson Watt had a famous rule for this. He called it the cult of the imperfect, and he summed it up with a phrase. "Give them the third best to go on with," he said. "The second best comes too late, and the best never comes at all." He chose a workable system now, over a perfect system never. By the time war broke out in September of 1939, there were 21 chain home stations operating along the British coast. Now here is what almost everyone gets wrong. The towers were not the secret. The radar hardware was the least impressive part of the whole achievement. To see the real invention, you have to follow the echo after it appears on the screen, and that is where Britain did something no other nation on earth had done. The man responsible was Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, the head of Fighter Command. Dowding understood something that the engineers did not always grasp. A radar echo is useless on its own. A girl in a coastal hut might see a blip and know that aircraft were approaching. But how many? How high? Heading where? And who needed to be told? A single radar station saw only its own slice of sky. Real defense meant combining every station, every report, and every observer on the ground into one single picture of the entire battle, and doing it fast enough to act. So Dowding built a nervous system for the air. Every radar station and every member of the Royal Observer Corps on the ground sent its information by dedicated telephone line to a central headquarters at Bentley Priory. There, in a room called the filter room, the flood of raw and often conflicting reports was sorted, cross-checked, and turned into clean, numbered tracks of enemy aircraft. That filtered picture was then pushed back out to the group and sector stations, which scrambled fighters and guided them by radio straight to the enemy. Anti-aircraft guns, searchlights, and barrage balloons were all woven into the same web. Much of this work was done by young women of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, standing around vast map tables, pushing wooden markers with long rakes like croupiers at a casino, calmly tracking life and death as it unfolded. This was the real weapon, not the radar, but the system that turned radar into decisions. Winston Churchill later wrote that all the courage of the Hurricane and Spitfire pilots would have been wasted without it, and that the like of it existed nowhere else in the world. It was, in effect, the world's first integrated air defense network. The Germans had faster, sharper radar sets. They did not have this. And that brings us back to why a German general flew an airship up the British coast and heard nothing. It was not incompetence. The Germans were looking for a German-style answer. Their own excellent radar sets, called Freya and Würzburg, worked on much shorter wavelengths. So when they searched for British radar, they searched in the wrong part of the spectrum and dismissed the long, clumsy chain-home signals as something old-fashioned and harmless. They were brilliant engineers looking for a machine. They never imagined that the machine was the least important part. This blindness continued into the Battle of Britain itself. In August of 1940, the Luftwaffe did finally attack the radar towers. On the 12th of August, dive bombers struck several stations along the south coast, and the station at Ventnor on the Isle of Wight was knocked out. But the open steel towers were hard to hit and hard to destroy. Blast passed straight through the lattice. The British raised mobile transmitters and faked signals to hide the gaps, and within days most stations were back. The Germans concluded that radar stations were too tough to be worth the effort, and they turned their attention elsewhere. They never understood that those towers were the eyes of the entire defense. Knock them out properly, and Fighter Command would have been fighting blind. The Germans walked away from the most valuable targets in England because they did not know what they were looking at. The German fighter ace Adolf Galland admitted the consequences after the war. The British, he wrote, detected his aircraft as they were still gathering over the French coast. Every movement was tracked and projected onto the screens in the British control centers. Fighter Command could place its fighters in exactly the right spot at exactly the right moment. The Germans were fighting an enemy that always seemed to know they were coming. Now the story turns, because so far Britain's advantage was about organization, not technology. That was about to change. In a laboratory at the University of Birmingham, two young physicists were about to hand Britain a genuine technological miracle. Their names were John Randall and Harry Boot. On the 21st of February 1940, they switched on a small device of their own design for the first time. It was called the resonant cavity magnetron. It was a heavy block of copper, small enough to hold in your hand, with holes drilled inside it. To understand why it mattered, you have to know the problem it solved. Everyone wanted radar that used very short waves, microwaves, because short waves give sharp, detailed pictures and need only small antennas. That would let you put radar inside an aircraft or on a small ship. But nobody could generate short waves with enough power to be useful. Randall and Boot's copper block changed that overnight. On its first proper test, it produced around 400 watts at a wavelength under 10 centimeters. That was roughly 100 times more power than anything available before at that wavelength. Within days, they pushed it higher, and soon it reached well over 1,000 watts. It was a leap so large it almost did not make sense. Britain now held a device that could shrink powerful radar down to fit in the nose of a night fighter or the belly of a bomber. But Britain was fighting for survival and could not mass-produce it fast enough. So in a remarkable gamble in September of 1940, a team led by the scientist Henry Tizard sailed to the still neutral United States, carrying one of these magnetrons in a black metal box. They simply handed it over, hoping American industry would build what Britain could not. The American historian James Finney Baxter later called it the most valuable cargo ever brought to our shores. It helped trigger an explosion of American research, and within the war, American factories would build over 1 million magnetrons. This little copper block gave the Allies airborne radar to hunt submarines in the dark of the Atlantic, radar for night fighters, and a device called H2S that let bomber crews map the ground below them through total cloud. And it was H2S that finally forced German engineers to see, with their own eyes, exactly how far behind they had fallen. On the night of the 2nd of February 1943, a British bomber carrying one of the new H2S sets was shot down near Rotterdam. The set survived almost intact. German technicians recovered it and named it the Rotterdam device. When the scientists of the Telefunken company examined it, they were stunned. At the heart of it sat the cavity magnetron, generating microwave power they had believed was simply not achievable. The shock was profound, because only months earlier, German leadership had decided that this entire field was a dead end and had effectively shut down their own centimeter wave research. They had concluded it could not be done. Now they were holding proof, pulled from the wreckage of an English bomber, that the British were already flying it over German cities every single night. There is an honest detail here that matters, because this story is not about German stupidity. German scientists actually understood the basic principle of the cavity magnetron. The theory was known. What broke their confidence was not the physics. It was discovering that Britain had taken an idea they had abandoned as impractical, turned it into a rugged piece of military equipment, and put it into mass service while they were still calling it impossible. They rushed to catch up. They formed a special working group to copy the device and scrambled to build detectors and decoys. But they never closed the gap before the war ended. So consider what the Germans missed, again and again. They flew an airship through Britain's defenses and reported nothing. They bombed the radar towers and then gave up on them. They dismissed long-wave radar as primitive. They declared microwave radar impossible. At every turn, the most technically gifted engineers in the world looked directly at what Britain was doing and failed to believe it. And the reason is the heart of this whole story. The Germans kept asking what machine the British had built. It was the wrong question. Britain's true advantage was never a single machine. It was a way of thinking. It was the willingness to accept an imperfect tower if it could be built in time. It was the decision to connect every station and every observer into one living picture of the sky. It was a quiet physicist's idea that powerful microwaves were worth chasing when others had stopped. The Germans were searching for a better device. The British had built a better idea, and an idea does not show up on a listening receiver. The people who made it real were mostly ordinary. A scientist asked to build a death ray, who built something far more useful instead. 2 young physicists with a block of copper, thousands of young women in headsets, pushing markers across a map through the worst nights of the war, holding the whole invisible picture together in their hands. None of them were trying to make history. They were trying to see an enemy coming in time to do something about it. In the end, that is exactly what they did, and their enemy never understood how until it was far too late.